Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our conversation focused on equity and a path forward for Black employees. I'm Dnika Travis, VP Research at Catalyst, and delighted and honored to be joined by Monne Williams of McKinsey Company. Monne is a partner in McKinsey's Atlanta office. Today's conversation is really grounded in a larger context of the challenges and the complexities and the opportunities that we're all facing right now as we seek to work together to build workplaces that are inclusive and equitable. It's really tough times right now, honestly, and we and people and communities and families across the world are really faced with difficult issues with the pandemic and calls for action around racial and gender equity and other tough issues, which is all connected to our conversation today. Personally, I really, in thinking about today's conversation with Monne, really got stuck, if you will, on the idea of a path forward. That concept and that idea really touches me deeply as a researcher, as a daughter of parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who lived in segregation times for some, who had their own fight towards us for civil rights and equity. And I'm inspired by their plight every day. I'm also a Black woman and a mother, and the idea of a path forward gives me hope. And so as we're talking about today's conversation, and Monne and I are going to talk about the research that's out there, we want to keep that in mind in terms of all of the complexities and all of the ways in which that path forward gives us hope and opportunity to really move forward. So with that, I'd like to dive right in with first kind of piece of the conversation and talking about with Monne about, can you share a little bit about the McKinsey's research and what it's reported in terms of some of the systemic barriers and challenges for Black employees in particular?
Thanks, Dnika, and excited to be here with you today. Before I dive into some of the challenges, I wanted to take your tone there and hit a personal note. Obviously, the firm is very invested in conducting this research, but I am too personally, as you mentioned. As somebody who benefits from this work and wants to help others who are coming behind me, I think it's important to really understand the root causes of some of the challenges that we're seeing and getting much more fact-based on what we can do about it. And so to dive into your question on some of the barriers, first, I want to highlight some of the bright spots that we see. From our research, we know that 4 in 5 Black workers that we surveyed are ambitious and want to be promoted in their jobs. We also know nearly 80% of Black workers report being or having a sense of accomplishment and purpose in the work. And so there really is a lot to build on. And while there is a lot to build on, we also see some real challenges that are going to make it difficult. And for me, the headline that really stands out from this report is that it's going to take nearly a century, 100 years, in order for Black workers to hit parity across all management levels in the private sector. And given all of the recent commitments around racial equity, especially for Black workers, I don't think anyone who's working on this thinks that 100 years is the right amount of time. And so I really want to focus on what we can do to make that faster and how we can share best practices across organizations to increase that timeline as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I read the report, and then I had to read it again. And then the data point that you're talking about in terms of 100 years, I had to read again because it's such an important point. And as you're talking about driving the conversation with facts and evidence, and from a perspective of fairness, there's so much there that is really aligned in terms of what we're both seeking to achieve through our research. And for example, with Catalyst and our emotional tax research, we really look at the experiences of being on guard to bias and protecting against those experiences and the impact that has on the workplace in terms of ability to thrive. We also found some health benefit outcomes in terms of impact on sleep and that sort of thing. And so looking at the holistic picture, and we've talked about this in our prep, there's the barriers and the challenges, but there's also the places that give us optimism and hope and that kind of thing. And so I'd like to kind of, as we reflect in this conversation, think about those, because I know how important they are to both of us personally, but how important they are to telling a full picture of the story as well. And so we know that Black employees in the private sector are likely to earn less than white employees, and that's also a big piece of the barriers that are faced. What explains the inequity of pay for Black employees?
In the course of our research, we looked at a few factors that are driving some of what we see in the pay question. So the first big one is that there is a mismatch currently between where Black workers live and where we expect to see the highest job growth. And just to put that in perspective, fewer than 1 in 10 Black workers today live in counties where we expect to see the highest job growth. And so there's a real mismatch. So in places like Provo, Utah, where we expect to see much higher job growth, there aren't large populations of Black workers there currently. And so there is that significant mismatch. The second is that there are, more Black workers in industries that are lower paying, as well as job types that are lower paying. And so when you look at the geography plus the types of jobs and the types of industries that Black workers are in, they are making less on average in those industries because those industries pay less. And so as we think about where Black workers should be going forward, what parts of the economy, it'll be important to think about the geographic where, but also which sectors, which types of jobs, when we think about the types of interventions that companies and other institutions are putting forward going forward. So how do you move more people to those higher paying industries and higher paying jobs like professional services or technology?
Right. And so how does gender differences factor into this? Can you expand a little bit on that? Because it's some really important points you're reflecting on here.
So we've seen over time that there is, women tend to be in some of these like lower paying occupations as well. I think the most interesting thing when we looked at Black workers in the context of this report is that Black women have a higher labor force participation than what we see with other racial groups. And so in our data set, for example, 45% of the people that we looked at for Black workers are women. And so any set of interventions that we think about going forward has to take the lens of intersectionality, because there are so many Black women that are already in the workforce. And how do organizations think about overcoming some of those challenges that we see, like this double broken rung? How do we get more Black women and Black workers in general moving from that frontline hourly to frontline salary position that we know is a really tough jump for people to make? How do we get more people, especially Black women, moving from that entry-level position to that first manager promotion? Because after we get more people to that manager promotion, we start to see more stabilizing in the pipeline. And so we think thinking about those critical points are important. And then, what are the roles that Black women are currently in? So if we look at things like allied health professionals, that's a really exciting space to be, because we expect to see growth in that area. And as we think about moving people from maybe lower paying jobs that they're in today to higher paying jobs within the industry, I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about there.
Right. Yeah. Really, really great points. And for those that are just joining, I'm Dnika Travis with Catalyst. Delighted to be joined here with Monne Williams from McKinsey, and we're talking about equity and a path forward for Black employees. You mentioned the double rung. I would love to just kind of expand on the audience what that means in terms of that barrier and challenge, and provide them some context there.
Sure. So in order to better understand the specifics of where we start to see some of the differences around representation and promotion and advancement in companies, we disaggregated the data. So how many people do we have at the frontline hourly level, frontline salary level, entry level, manager level, et cetera, throughout the different organizations who participated in our research. And we saw two specific points in the pipeline where we start to see some real drop off. The first is between that frontline hourly and frontline salary jump. And so there are just the number of frontline hourly jobs outnumber frontline salary jobs by about 20-1. And so it's really important for organizations to figure out the pathway to opportunity for all employees who are in those frontline hourly jobs, because typically when you go to frontline salary, there are better benefits, better salaries, better opportunity going forward as well. But it's particularly important for Black workers because they represent about 19% of those frontline hourly workers, and then it drops to 13% at that salary level. So that's the first broken rung that we see in our research. The second is when you go into entry level, so thinking much more about corporate jobs, we are about 13% entry level jobs, which is great, which is higher or a little higher than what we see for the overall Black private sector working population. But that drops down to 7% in that first promotion to manager. And so if you lose that many people in that first promotion, it is quite hard to make up that that difference later in the pipeline. So when you start thinking about directors or senior vice presidents, C-level folks within the company. And so fixing those two breakpoints or broken rungs in the pipeline will be critical if we want to get more people later in the funnel as well to those more senior positions.
Yeah, thank you for that. It really talks about the importance of looking at the whole context of the systemic issues and the organizational culture that can, really be reflected of where we need to be able to make change, and particularly in today's current climate with COVID-19 and job loss and people moving and changing jobs and remote working and all of the, as mentioned at the start of it, all the calls in for racial justice and the ways that we're really, all of those things are entangled. What do you think people really need to be paying attention to right now?
So many things to pay attention to. I'll focus on a couple today that I think are pretty pertinent, especially as we look at return to work and what that could look like in this post-COVID environment, as you mentioned. Some of my colleagues did some research recently on, is it the great attrition or is it really the great attraction? And there were a few things that they called out in that research that I think are particularly poignant as we think about Black workers and the path forward. One is that there really is a fundamental disconnect between why employers think that people are leaving the workforce or changing their working habits versus what employees actually think and want and believe. And so the most critical thing, I think, is for organizations to really take the time to understand the starting point. What do workers want? What do they need? What are they complaining about? What are some of the pain points in your organization? And how might that vary by different groups? So is it a different story for Black workers versus some of the other groups in your organization? And then the other thing I would call out, going back to some of our earlier research on this, is that connection opportunities is something that really has struggled in the context of the pandemic. And so what are the ways in which you're going to create opportunities for your employees to meet each other, to feel connected to managers, to really understand the broader ethos of the organization and feel like they have real support and community at work? And there are ways to do that virtually, of course. And obviously people are starting to do some of that in person where it's safe as well. And then the second is really this career pathing question, which goes back to the frontline worker conversation we were having. How do you help create more paths for people to find, opportunities so that they feel much more connected to the work, to your organization, and want to stay because they believe that you're invested in them and their long-term career success as well? And given that we see so many Black workers in that frontline population, as well as at the entry level, I think that career pathing piece will be especially important to stay close to and really figure out some clear answers to as people go back to work and are thinking about, is this a place I see myself long-term?
Yeah, I'm the great attraction versus attrition debate really resonates with me, and in the way that you kind of talk about and fold into the role of the culture. In particular, I think about the connection piece, and it just reminds me of a study that my colleagues just released now on empathy and the role of empathy and manager empathy in particular in really boosting productivity. And we found that demonstrating that care and that concern as a vital skill is really important for productivity and positive employee outcomes, and important to that equation when we're talking about connection. So such an important point. Thank you for sharing that in attraction versus attrition, or I'm going to keep that in mind too. How can employees and how can organization and organizational leaders really better support Black employees? What's needed there?
I think there are 5 things that organizations can do to support all employees, and I think that certainly includes Black employees. The first is, what is your aspiration for advancing racial equity? It needs to be specific and measurable, and you need to understand exactly what you're trying to achieve, so that people know when you've actually achieved it or when you haven't, and you can have the appropriate conversations about that. And from our research, we see that diversity, equity, inclusion is a very high priority. I think nearly 80% of our respondents said that it's a top priority for them, but they don't see the same sort of reciprocity in their managers and their respective organizations. So that's an important one. The second is understanding your baseline. Where are you starting from, so that you know the types of things that are going to be critical interventions that are going to help you move the needle and get the sorts of results that you might want to see in terms of retention or promotion, and being able to hire externally where appropriate. The third is you probably are already doing lots of things as an organization, but have you prioritized as strategically and as smartly as you should? And are you really focusing on the things that matter and putting outsized resources and time there? And then related to that, where you see really good things working in the organization, like how are you reinforcing those and using them in other areas where you might be able to get similar results? And for the things that aren't working, reimagine those. Stop doing what's not working. Don't spend resources on those, but really figure out what might help you close the gap in some of the areas where you still might be having some challenges. And then the last piece is really about tracking progress so that you can drive accountability. We really would expect to see much more progress if people could see, what are we going toward? How are we tracking toward that? And where are we today? And what's the different types of, corrective action that we might want to take in order to improve our likelihood of success? And I think really making that an iterative process as you get more data, you try new things, and being really clear on what you're solving for should help to create better opportunities and changing the system that we're working in for Black employees.
Great. Yeah, thank you. For those who are joining us, I'm here with Monne Williams from McKinsey, and I'm Dnika Travis with Catalyst, and we're talking about equity and a path forward for Black employees. Monne was just laying out what actions organizations can take, and you really summarized, I think, in summary, thinking about 3 points that you made in your reflections on focusing what matters, how critical that is, and really prioritizing that to highlight the aspects of the organization that you really need to change and make a difference in. One other things that you said that I think is really critical is you said, think about what's working well, and reflect on that and really build that as well, and assess that and understand that and use data and metrics to be able to guide those decision-making processes and how important those are too. And the combination of those really, shine a light in many ways onto helping organizations really think about how to take action. So for those managers and individuals on the call, think about how, I wonder how, people in this conversation now and listening to us, what they can do when they, are in their next meeting or in, within the next 24 hours, what kind of advice or thoughts would you give in terms of how they can take action?
There's one in particular that I always think of. And in our research, we see that nearly 90% of companies said that they had some sort of sponsorship program in place, but less than a third of Black employees said that they had a sponsor, and less than a quarter believe that they had the necessary support in order to advance in their respective organizations. So I think there's a real sponsorship gap. And I think that's something that all managers and leaders in organizations can take some personal, action toward. Do you understand the types of career aspirations that the people you're responsible for have? Are you helping them think about the next steps and who they need to know from a networking standpoint in order to build the support for that? Are you really helping them think about the next opportunity that's going to be a stretch assignment for them to demonstrate that sort of readiness for the role? And what are the things that you can do in their day-to-day to really show that there is support and active engagement around them developing their careers? I think is a really tactical next step for most leaders, and something that we see Black employees would certainly benefit from, but certainly all employees would benefit from based on the research that we've seen from this report.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. We are getting a couple of questions, and I'm just going to intermix them before we get to the final messages and points, because, and I really am grateful for this question coming in, because it is Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month. And part of what we find in our research, particularly around emotional attacks at Catalyst, is that the experience of being on guard and the barriers faced, there's a lot of shared experiences when we're looking at Black and Brown, Asian and Indigenous, multiracial employees. And it's really important to look at the shared experience as well as the unique ones. And so this question is really, really important for that conversation. So it's Hispanic Heritage, Latinx Heritage Month. How does the focus on Black employees also benefit other people of color? Thank you for sharing that question.
I love that question.
Yes.
I really love that question. It makes me think of some research that some of our friends at Policy Link 2 supported the work on this report as well with us around the curb cut effect. And so you think about the curb cuts and sidewalks that make it easier for people who use wheelchairs to actually get on the sidewalk, but it's helpful for all of us if you have a suitcase or a cart or just something heavy that you're trying to get in. And so when you think about all of the ways in which, bringing up the folks who are getting disproportionately impacted negatively by some of the trends in the workplace could benefit everyone. So for example, that sponsorship point, we see that Black workers are definitely undersponsored, but in general, employees in the corporate setting report being undersponsored. And so the types of programs and interventions that you create for Black employees could certainly help all employees and certainly help the Latinx community as well. When you think about the types of things that might be working around external hiring and how are we partnering with HBCUs and other institutions that may give us, better connections to Black workers, taking the same model and thinking about Hispanic serving institutions and like tribal institutions as well. And how does that help you think about your potential worker population in a different way? I think it really helps us think about different frameworks and contexts and things that we can apply to old problems, but new solutions that I think will help us, think about all of these groups as really vital parts of our workplace environments and figuring out how do we get more people coming into our organizations, but then how do we keep them there and how do we keep them engaged and happy and ready to contribute in a meaningful way, as we see from the research they all want to.
Yeah, and that's the attraction side of the equation that you were talking about earlier, and how important it is to not just focus on what happens after someone leaves, but actually ensuring that we have those processes, practices, and programs in place within the organization to really support all people of color and all individuals. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat so that we can share them. We do have another question. Any reflections on how your recommendations may be approached differently for non-corporate workplaces that aren't the same necessarily as corporate settings?
Yes.
On that.
So much closer on the corporate setting and what we looked at, but we also did look at frontline workers as a part of this research and want to continue that effort as we think about the next iteration of this research as well, which we're starting to embark on now. But I think the process around being really clear on what your aspirations are and then really creating the fact base around what you want to achieve, I think that is a no regret move, whatever type of organization you're in. And then starting to think about what are the other resources that you have available. So the types of places that you recruit from, or how you think about what your employee value proposition is and the role of inclusion in your workplace. All those things could look very different. But I think that the base process and the approach that you take to figure out, what really matters in your context is the same if it's a corporate environment or, a manufacturing environment or something very different altogether.
Excellent. Yeah, I've worked in nonprofit. I mean, I work in a nonprofit now, but I've actually done this type of work in nonprofits as well prior to coming to Catalyst. And the points you make are exceptional in terms of those experiences can be the same. And we have to have that same laser focus on prioritization in those settings.
Dnika, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I know Catalyst has done quite a bit of research in this space as well, and thinking about some of the systemic barriers that all workers face, but especially women and workers of color. Would love to flip one of your questions that you asked me back on you. What are some of the things that you see from your research that organizations and or leaders in those organizations can do to support workers and Black workers specifically?
Yeah, a lot of what I would say really mirror what you're finding in your research. I mean, we're really aligned in that way, and I think there's so much power in having research come from different places and different methodologies that all kind of point to the same need to have, as mentioned, a laser focus and commitment to understanding the unique challenges and barriers that people of color are faced within the organization, and at the same time understanding those lived experiences and being open to the conversations about what's happening outside the workplace. So, for example, I mentioned our emotional tax work. That being on guard and that sense of having to brace yourself for insults, to constantly prepare to greet the day with knowing that you're potentially going to face discrimination and what that does, to your being, can happen in or outside of the workplace. But what we found in our research, again, with Black employees, Asian, Latino, Indigenous, and multiracial employees, that it has an impact on our ability to thrive at work. It has ability of retention. It has an impact on sleep patterns. And so that has huge implications, right? And so understanding those lived experiences, being willing to talk about them, even if the conversations aren't perfect and even if they're uncomfortable, are really important. And I also would just say this with what you said about data. It's really important in those conversations to also have that hard look in the mirror, right? What are the biases? What am I doing personally that could be replicating and creating systemic, or challenges for people even unwittingly and unknowingly? And at the same time, a hard look at data to support that more macro approach. So I think that we're so aligned in how we're thinking about this and what we're finding in the work that I think is really compelling as well. So I think we have, so great. Thank you, Monne, for that as well. I think we have time for a couple more questions. What role can affinity groups play in helping employees feel empowered and connected to their coworkers and the world around them?
So in our research, we saw that about 2/3 of Black workers who are a part of employee resource groups or affinity groups felt like they did a really good job of creating a sense of community and connection to their organizations. So I think that is a great thing to think about. So if this is a way to create that connectivity between workers and their respective organizations, you have that as a base. Then what? We did see, more of a drop off when we think about the ability of those groups to help with professional opportunities or to help people think about advancement. And so for organizations who are looking to their ERGs or affinity groups to help with that, I think the challenge is now to say, how could you help restructure those organizations or those groups, and thinking about the ways in which you might be able to change the way in which you work with some of the leaders in the organization. So one example would be, there are lots of times where a senior leader in the organization will come to speak to an affinity group and, talk more about the organization. And that's great. They share their story, people get to hear more, but you don't necessarily see as that senior leader all the work that the members of the affinity group are doing. And that might be a real key for you being able to be a sponsor or a real supporter of one of those employees or a lot of those employees to help them think about career progression in their work. So how could you create more opportunities for those senior leaders to see those affinity group members in action is one thing I'd like to think a little bit more about and figure out how companies can act on that as well.
Yeah, great question, great insight as well and perspective on that. And I think I add with affinity groups and to also think about who you're tapping and to lead those positions and how they can be supported and to just there's a lot of real conversations about the roles of people of color leading initiatives and focused on people of color and how important it is to be supported in those roles as well. And so there's a lot of considerations for organizational leaders in terms of that design piece of it as well. And Catalyst, just as a plug, we did just release a new ERG toolkit as well. And so hats off to my colleagues for doing that work.
I love your point on not overtaxing the employee resource groups and especially their leaders, because we do depend on those groups so much to drive a lot of what's happening in companies. And it is real hard and challenging work. And those people deserve to be recognized and appropriately credited for what they're doing.
Yep, absolutely. And that's one of the things when you ask me about the things that can be done, really surfacing those things that could seem normal and regular and status quo, but also have an undercurrent in terms of stymieing inclusion, because we're not talking about the ways in which people of color may get overtaxed, right? That's bringing those uncomfortable conversations, actually really critical for that path forward. We have to see what's right in front of us as well. So I think we are about done with questions. And do you have any final closing action points? I really thank you, Monne. You've been incredible in providing that insight and perspective in a much needed space. Closing comments as well.
I'll go back to a point that I started with on some of the bright spots. We know that 4 in 5 Black workers want to be promoted. We know that nearly 80% of them really see that they are creating a sense of purpose and accomplishment in their work. And so we have a workforce that wants to do more and is already, there and willing to do it. And so how much better could it be if we figure out a way to get more people in all of these roles at different parts of the pipeline? And, how much more could organizations do and be great places to work for all employees if they really crack that? So my point is, like, take the gift that you've been given with these employees and figure out how to make it easier for them to do their best work at work, because they really are facing some barriers at different points in the pipeline, as we talked about, and that'll be critical.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining our conversation about equity and a path forward for Black employees. We have Monne Williams, partner with McKinsey, and people can certainly be able to look and see the recording of this conversation and learn more at Catalyst. Please feel free to check out McKinsey's research as well. Very insightful and important part of the conversation. Thank you all. Thank you.